In the last quarter of the 19th century, industrial capitalism spawned a new race for empire. For most of the century, through the 1870s, old European empires established much earlier in the, quote, New World, declined or disappeared. Revolutions had divested Great Britain, France, Portugal, and Spain of most or all of their colonies in the Americas. But in the last quarter of the 19th century, industrial nations faced global economic depressions. The first occurred in the 1870s, and a second, even more severe depression in the 1890s. Business leaders blamed overproduction for these economic convulsions. Industrial capitalism had produced a glut of goods that simply could not be absorbed in established markets. Finding new consumers in the world's untapped markets, manufacturers believed, would solve the problem. Colonies also bestowed prestige on imperial powers as well as access to raw materials. Africa, Asia, and the islands of the Pacific were the most sought-after prizes in the competition for colonies. Racialist theories propped up by new, allegedly scientific claims of white intellectual and moral superiority over darker-skinned peoples provided ideological justification for colonization. Colonists also presented themselves as aiding and, quote, uplifting the uncivilized. Missionaries intent in spreading the Christian gospel abroad often laid the groundwork for expansion, and businessmen and political leaders soon followed in their footsteps. The U.S., unlike European powers, did not have a long tradition of empire building. After all, the nation had been established by repudiating Great Britain's colonial claims. In the 19th century, the political extension of the United States beyond its continental boundaries represented a new departure. But in many ways, colonization abroad continued the federal government's policies of westward expansion within the continental U.S. and its conquest of indigenous peoples. Even as many Americans remained uneasy about the nation's scramble for empire abroad, a combination of crises in the 1890s, economic, social, political, and cultural, thrust the nation into the global scramble for empire. Creating new consumers did not necessarily lead to colonization. The world's strongest industrial powers, particularly Great Britain and the U.S., generally preferred open-door policies. In other words, they asked only for unhindered access to markets where, they confidently believed, they could compete successfully against economic rivals. But weaker industrial nations preferred the security of colonies. Once nations began to stake colonial claims in less developed parts of the world, international rivalries soon pushed all industrial nations into a scramble for empire. By 1899, even the U.S., which had pursued a commercial empire with great success, followed its European rivals in creating formal colonies. The untapped markets of Africa, Asia, and the Pacific, as well as their natural resources, loomed large in the eyes of expansionists. Factories required rubber, vegetable oils, and minerals such as copper. Beginning in the 1870s and accelerating in the 1880s, European powers ruthlessly carved up most of Africa into colonies. In 1884 to 1885, they met in Berlin without the presence of a single African nation, primarily to deal with rival claims in the Congo and Niger basins, but ultimately to divide much of the continent among themselves. Their actions set off decades of bloody wars to gain control of territories on the continent. Although not seeking land, U.S. representatives succeeded in getting a pledge from European powers to an open door to market goods in the Belgian Congo. Asia was just as alluring as Africa to imperialists. European powers partitioned Southeast Asia as they had Africa in the 1880s, with France acquiring Indochina and Britain annexing Burma. China, a weak nation at the time with 300 million people and potential consumers, would be the site of numerous conflicts among the rival world powers. European powers and Japan, quote, carved the Chinese melon into territorial slices of domination as the U.S. demanded fair access to the China market. In the 1880s and 1890s, many Pacific islands were annexed. The U.S. annexed Hawaii in 1898 and claimed the Philippines, Guam, and Puerto Rico as colonies the same year. Between 1876 and 1915, the world's powers, imposing colonialism around the globe, claimed roughly 25% of the world's lands and peoples. Treatment of Indians provided important precedents for empire building. Not only did the U.S. acquire by force lands that had belonged to Indians, it also rejected the right of native peoples to rule themselves and imposed direct rule on them. In addition, the Supreme Court ruled in 1884 that Indians born of reservations were not citizens but instead nationals who owed allegiance to the U.S. but had none of the privileges of citizenship, a status that lasted until 1924. These legal concepts were later applied to colonized peoples in both Puerto Rico until 1917 and the Philippines. A combination of crises in the 1890s, economic, social, political, and cultural, thrust the nation into the global scramble for empire. Even as the U.S. extended its global economic reach into foreign markets after the Civil War, economic convulsions pointed to the need for new markets. In 1865, American exports totaled $281 million. By 1898, they topped $1.2 billion. But despite massive economic growth and industrial production, the depressions of the 1870s and 1890s convinced many Americans that overproduction of goods was the source of economic turmoil. Both domestic markets and current foreign markets could no longer absorb the massive output of American industry and agriculture. New markets would secure America's position as the world's greatest industrial power and would guarantee peace domestically. The social turbulence spawned by the Depression of 1893 to 1897, including massive unemployment, farm foreclosures, and labor strife, convinced Democrats, Republicans, and populists that new markets would provide the antidote to the nation's domestic problems. In 1893, as the stock market tanked, a young history professor named Frederick Jackson Turner added to a growing anxiety with a highly influential essay entitled "The Significance of the Frontier in American History." Turner explained that according to the 1890 census, the frontier had disappeared with the complete settlement of the West. The closing of the frontier had, he argued, many serious consequences. Most importantly, because economic power secures political power, free land in the West had been essential to maintaining American freedom and opportunity, Turner argued. The ability of its people to expand into free lands threatened the very future of the Republic. Support for expansion also came from military experts anxious about international prestige and defense. As European powers and Japan competed for global influence, some argued that the U.S. could not stand idly by. If it failed to contend for empire, many believed, the nation would be left behind as a second-tier power and inevitably decline in a world where only the strongest survived. Moreover, at the very least, simple self-defense required a vigorous foreign policy. If not checked, foreign powers might even dominate in the Western Hemisphere. Although since the declaration of the Monroe Doctrine in 1823, the U.S. had managed to reduce foreign influence in the Americas, Great Britain, with its Caribbean possessions, with Canada as part of its Commonwealth, and with its domination of South American trade, remained a major player in the hemisphere. To prepare for the nation's new global role, Congress authorized the modernization of the U.S. Navy, a fleet in disrepair since the Civil War. Captain Alfred Thayer Mahan, director of the Naval War College, emerged as the leading proponent of a new navy. In his highly influential series of lectures, published in 1890 as The Influence of Sea Power Upon History, 1660 to 1783, Mahan contended that history proved that a powerful navy provided the key to attain national greatness and international power, to expand commerce, and to ensure national security. To control the oceans was to control the world. Colonies played a crucial role in Mahan's theory, to provide strategic military bases and coaling stations for far-flung global conflicts that were sure to come. Other Americans in the 1880s and 1890s, like Mahan, advocated for a muscular foreign policy. They viewed war as an antidote to what they deemed as the, quote, crisis of over-civilization. According to contemporary observers, American men, the middle-class man specifically, had grown soft and flabby. They spent too much time working indoors with little physical activity. Whereas their fathers had fought in the Civil War, they slaved away in their offices pursuing money instead of greatness on the battlefield. Many worried that the current generation was not tough enough, their, quote, manly spirit dissipated by their soft white-collar world. Theodore Roosevelt, one of the leading disciples of the cult of strenuosity, challenged the nation in the 1890s to boldly face the life of strife. Quote, over-sentimentality, over-softness, and mushiness are the great danger of this age and this people, end quote. Despite a resurgence in physical activities in the 1890s, especially rough sports such as boxing and football, many young men longed for the ultimate test, to fight in a war to prove their manhood and to reinvigorate the nation. The U.S. had no overarching long-range plan to create a political empire. Instead, policymakers initially emphasized commercial growth. In the 1880s, Secretary of State James G. Blaine explained, quote, "Our great demand is expansion," end quote. He noted, however, that this did not mean annexation of territory, but rather annexation of trade. But a decade of aggressive foreign policy intent on expanding and protecting the nation's global commercial empire, coupled with the crises of the 1890s, paved the way for the establishment of a political empire. First asserting dominance in the Western Hemisphere, U.S. policymakers soon defined the nation's strategic interests broadly and forcefully in the Pacific and Asia as well. The 3-month-long Spanish-American-Philippine War in 1898 paid huge dividends to the U.S. Entered into with limited aims, ostensibly to aid Cuban independence and defend American business interests, the war resulted in control of Cuba, Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines. Although a latecomer, the U.S., with its modern navy playing a key role, now joined its European and Japanese rivals as participants in the new imperialism. Beginning in the 1880s, the U.S. embarked on a more expansive foreign policy in Latin America to protect markets and American investments there. Secretary of State James Blaine, who served under Republican Presidents James Garfield and Benjamin Harrison, was the chief architect of this new policy, which would last well into the 20th century. Blaine asserted that the U.S. must maintain stability in Latin America to guarantee healthy trade and to secure its markets. In 1890, Blaine played a key role in Congress's passage of the first major reciprocal tariff. This legislation allowed certain goods from Latin America, such as sugar, coffee, and hides, to enter the country with no tariff as long as Latin American countries allowed the free passage of U.S. goods in return. Trade with Cuba and Brazil exploded as a result. Subsequent administrations embraced Blaine's policy. Interference in the internal affairs of Latin American countries and even military intervention soon resulted. In 1893, for instance, when Brazilian monarchists encouraged by the British threatened to revolt against the recently established pro-American Republican regime, President Grover Cleveland helped quash the revolution at the behest of U.S. business interests. Venezuela emerged as a trouble spot a few years later, in 1895-96. A long-disputed border between Venezuela and British Guiana catalyzed American intervention when Great Britain reasserted its claims to territory that included the gateway to trade for much of the continent. Citing the Monroe Doctrine, President Cleveland insisted that the British arbitrate the disputed land claim. When Great Britain ignored his request, an angry Cleveland explained that not only would the U.S. enforce the Monroe Doctrine in the dispute, but it would also resist by every means in its power Britain's Venezuelan claims. Great Britain, caving into U.S. demands, ultimately lost its territorial claims as arbiters sided with Venezuela, and the U.S. reinforced its dominance in the Western Hemisphere. The U.S. also engaged in muscular foreign policy beyond the Caribbean. Asserting itself in the Pacific, it protected business interests established earlier by American missionaries and traders. In 1875, the American-dominated government of Hawaii had established a reciprocity agreement with the U.S. that allowed Hawaiian sugar to enter the nation duty-free. This resulted in the tripling of sugar production in 10 years. But the McKinley Tariff, passed by Congress in 1890, ended Hawaii's favored status and threatened the sugar industry there. Immediately, Americans in Hawaii began to pursue annexation to the U.S. as a solution to support their export problems. As the Hawaiian economy nearly collapsed, Queen Lulukalani threatened American domination when she ascended to the throne upon her brother's death in 1891. 4 years earlier, Americans in Hawaii had implemented a new constitution, referred to by Native Hawaiians as the, quote, bayonet constitution. It limited the political power of natives and their monarchy. In 1893, the Queen, intent on returning control of the islands to her people, now a minority in their own country, drew up another constitution that restored the power of the monarchy and returned political rights to Native Hawaiians. But American missionary planter interests, headed by Stanford B. Dole, organized a coup and overthrew the Queen. At their request, supported by the U.S. minister in Hawaii, the American government dispatched Marines to prevent the Queen and her supporters from fighting back. Americans wanted Cuba for many years before the 1890s. The crown jewel of the Spanish Empire in the Caribbean, Cuba was but 90 miles off the coast of South Florida. Before the Civil War, pro-slavery advocates discussed annexing the island, and, beginning in the 1830s, American investors such as the Atkins family of Boston engaged in the sugar trade, providing credit to sugar planters. After the Civil War, these investors became planters themselves. In 1882, E. Atkins and Company of Boston emerged as the largest landowner on the islands. Cubans, who had long chafed under Spanish rule and had instigated numerous unsuccessful rebellions, launched yet another revolution against Spain in the 1890s. In 1894, U.S. tariff agreements granting Hawaiian sugar favored status plunged Cubans into an economic crisis. Economic collapse and unemployment only served to remind Cubans of their lack of political power. In February 1895, Cuban insurgents took advantage of widespread discontent and began to fight against Spanish authorities. By 1896, revolutionaries, under the banner of Cuba Libre, took their fight to the countryside. Torching sugar fields, they vowed that there would be no peace, production, or protection of property until Spain granted independence. Intent on holding on to the last jewel in its once expansive necklace of colonies, Spain attempted to crush the rebellion with an iron fist. Led by General Valeriano Valer, who proclaimed, quote, "I believe that war should be answered with war," end quote, Spain increased its army to 200,000 men. Valer realized that he could quash the rebellion only by suffocating the rural, peasant communities that provided support to the rebels. In the fall of 1896, in an attempt to snuff out the rebellion, he formulated a new policy, reconcentración, ordering the rural population to move to designated, fortified areas under Spanish control. Spanish soldiers also burned villages, food supplies, and peasant fields, slaughtered animals, and destroyed any resource that could aid the insurgents. Valer's policies created hundreds of thousands of refugees, and tens of thousands of sick and hungry Cubans perished. Developments in Cuba quickly captured the attention of Americans. The rebellion and scorched earth tactics of both sides threatened American investments, which were estimated at $15 million on the island at the start of the war. Many also feared that Cuba might easily be plucked from Spain by a much more powerful European rival. Major newspapers, especially those owned by William Randolph Hearst and Joseph Pulitzer, competed for readers by publishing sensational front-page stories that described atrocities in Cuba. Yellow journalism, as it was dubbed, named after a popular comic strip character named the Yellow Kid, provoked widespread public support for Cuban rebels. Vivid, often fabricated stories portrayed the brutal policies of, quote, butcher Valor. Newspapers cried out for American military intervention on behalf of the insurgents. Despite wide-ranging concerns, neither the Democratic Cleveland administration in its final year when the revolution exploded in 1895-96, nor the subsequent Republican administration of William McKinley acted hastily. Rather than jump into war, McKinley sought a diplomatic solution to the Cuban crisis. In 1897, his first year in office, he demanded that Spain implement reforms to end the Cuban revolt. Spain complied by removing Valor, declaring amnesty to insurgents, and establishing a liberal government that granted Cuba partial independence. But halfway measures only angered Spanish loyalists and those seeking independence. The crisis in Cuba worsened as the Spanish lost control. When riots by Spanish loyalists tore through Havana in late 1897, McKinley ordered the battleship USS Maine to Havana Harbor to protect American citizens and property. February 15, 1898, the Maine blew up in Havana Harbor, killing 260 of 276 American soldiers aboard the ship. Most Americans immediately concluded, as did Assistant Secretary of the Navy Theodore Roosevelt, that the explosion was an act of, quote, dirty treachery on the part of the Spanish, end quote. A hastily convened Naval Board of Inquiry conducted an investigation and concluded that a detonated mine had destroyed the ship. The public clamored even more loudly for war, declaring, quote, remember the Maine, to hell with Spain, end quote. On April 11, 1898, after attempting a final diplomatic solution, McKinley asked Congress for a declaration of war against Spain, which it passed unanimously. The nation embarked on its war with Spain in a near holiday spirit. As men responded enthusiastically to McKinley's call for troops and eagerly embraced the chance to fight, women organized relief associations to support the troops. But the nation found itself unprepared for war, and logistical problems plagued the campaign. Many soldiers, for instance, never received proper equipment or training. They lacked even the most basic necessities, such as tents and mess kits. In addition, the government issued standard wool uniforms, unsuitable for a summer war in a tropical climate. As soldiers gathered in Tampa, Florida, to embark for Cuba, Commodore George Dewey scored the first American victory of the war on the other side of the globe. In February 1898, 10 days after the Maine explosion, Assistant Secretary of the Navy Theodore Roosevelt ordered Dewey to engage the Spanish in the Pacific colony, the Philippines, should war break. On May 1st, Dewey defeated the Spanish fleet in Manila Bay without losing a single man. The Philippines had hardly figured into the discussion leading up to the war, which focused on freeing Cuba from Spanish rule. But with the China market endangered in 1898, the U.S. immediately expanded its war against Spain to include the strategically located Philippines. As Captain Mahan noted a few months after Dewey's victory, quote, the port of Manila is very centrally situated as regards the whole sweep of the eastern coast of Asia, end quote. By late June, the first American ground troops arrived in Manila. On August 12, 1898, the Spanish signed a protocol of peace ending the war after only 3 months. Within that short time, U.S. war aims had expanded considerably. American troops had not only defeated the Spanish in Cuba and Manila Bay, but they had also seized Guam and Puerto Rico. In July 1898, just as the war heated up, Congress approved the annexation of Hawaii. On August 14th, 2 days after Spain agreed to end the war, but before word of the war's end reached the Philippines, American troops, with the aid of Filipino rebels, captured the city of Manila. In a matter of weeks, the U.S. had substantially extended its influence and power in the Pacific and Asia. As Captain Mahan had predicted, naval power proved to be the key to American victory and world standing. In Cuba, U.S. war aims changed from a war of liberation into a war of conquest. Despite its high-toned language on behalf of Cuban independence, the American War Declaration did not recognize the rebels or their provisional government, as the U.S. remained intent on controlling the war and its aftermath. Refusing to allow the rebels to take an active part in the war against Spain, military leaders as well as journalists increasingly depicted them in negative racial stereotypes. They seemed surprised that many Cubans were dark-skinned and African in descent. One officer described them as, quote, lazy, cowardly, dirty, and childlike, clearly incapable of self-government. The Treaty of Paris, signed in December 1898, officially ended the war with Spain pending Senate ratification. Spain ceded Cuba and Puerto Rico in the Caribbean and Guam and the Philippines for an additional $20 million in the Pacific. The war proved to be a stunning debut for a nation as a world power. Americans generally basked in the glow of their victory over Spain. A nation hungry for heroes embraced naval hero Commodore Dewey, who even appeared in soap ads, and the press published numerous stories about the feats of Theodore Roosevelt and the Rough Riders. Americans also celebrated the national reconciliation evident in the Spanish-American-Philippine War. The war provided the first opportunity since the Civil War for Northerners and Southerners to fight as a united nation against a common foe. The press highlighted the fact that the first American soldier to die in battle was a Southerner. The colonization of the Philippines sparked bitter debate across the nation. Although a poll found that the overwhelming majority favored empire, with Westerners most supportive, critics swiftly organized. In November 1898 in Boston, concerned Americans formed the Anti-Imperial League, which soon boasted 25,000 members. The league included a wide range of some of the nation's most prominent citizens, including reformer Jane Addams, former President Grover Cleveland, labor leader Samuel Gompers, President Hopeful and former Congressman William Jennings Bryan, African-American intellectual W.E.B. Du Bois, and steel magnate Andrew Carnegie, who allegedly offered to buy the Philippines for $20 million and grant them their independence. Anti-imperialists rejected colonization as un-American, inconsistent with the nation's ideals. A republic, they argued, could not be an empire. As Senator George Frisbee Hoar of Massachusetts summarized, quote, "The danger is that we are to be transformed from a republic founded on the Declaration of Independence, the hope of the poor, the refuge of the oppressed, into a vulgar, commonplace empire founded upon physical force, controlling subject races and vassal states." End quote. Imperialists denigrated such talk as old-fashioned. America, explained Senator Albert Beveridge of Indiana, a leading voice for colonization, is, quote, "the young man of the nations. We are engaged in our great rivalry with the other powers of the world, and this is the destiny of every nation that achieves its manhood." The issue of race figured prominently on both sides of the debate. Some Americans, especially Southern senators in the midst of disenfranchising black voters, feared the addition of more people of color to the United States. Imperialists assured them that they could be annexed, as Indians had been, without granting them voting rights. At the same time, African Americans criticized the U.S. for allegedly expanding democracy to the Philippines while denying it to blacks at home. Booker T. Washington, for instance, endorsed self-governance for the Philippines, remarking, quote, "Until our nation has settled the Negro and Indian problem, I do not believe that we have a right to assume more social problems." End quote. But imperialists argued that Anglo-Saxons, as racial superiors, bore a responsibility to govern and ultimately, quote, "uplift their inferiors and to bestow on them the glories of democracy." After intense debate, the Senate ratified the peace treaty and the annexation of the Philippines by a vote of 57 to 27 in February 1898. But controversy over the Philippines was far from over. Even as the Senate ratified the peace treaty with Spain, the U.S. found itself entangled in an ugly war of oppression against Filipinos demanding their independence. Led by Emilio Iguanado, freedom fighters had aided U.S. troops when they invaded the islands, viewing them as allies against colonialism. When the U.S., in turn, colonized the Philippines, Aguinaldo led his warriors against the new imperialists. After fighting a conventional war in November 1899, Aguinaldo organized a guerrilla campaign against U.S. occupiers. American soldiers could not tell friend from foe, and a bloody, brutal war of attrition ensued. Atrocities abounded and frustrations mounted, yet the powerful U.S. was unable to subdue the outnumbered, outgunned rebels. Quickly devolving into a race war, the American-Philippine conflict fueled the brutal treatment of Filipinos, civilians, and guerrilla fighters alike. Moreover, soldiers and officers, along with journalists and politicians, continually compared the Filipinos to Native Americans. In their view, the war against Aguinaldo was just another Indian war, likening him to Sitting Bull and Tecumseh, and his followers became Apaches, Sioux, and savages who needed to be conquered for their own good. Most regular U.S. officers and troops came from the West with vivid memories of Indian warfare. The treatment of Filipinos deeply angered many African American soldiers who served in the Philippines. Some identified with the Filipinos as fellow people of color victimized by white supremacists. Although some black soldiers defended the war, others helped publicize the atrocities, despite the U.S. government's efforts to censor negative views from the islands. They dispatched numerous letters home, published in the black press. Some even deserted and joined forces with Aguinaldo and fought against the U.S. After declaring victory several times, the U.S. finally suppressed the insurgents, for the most part after 3 years in 1902. But rebellion against occupation continued to erupt for many years afterward, and the U.S. domination came at a steep price. The U.S. spent $400 million to stifle the revolt, and more than 126,000 American soldiers fought against the Filipino rebels. Roughly 4,200 Americans and 1,800 Filipinos died in battle. At least 250,000 Filipinos succumbed to gunfire, disease, and starvation. An Atlantic power before the war, the U.S., with the conquest of the Philippines, was now a Pacific power too, with naval bases and coaling stations to extend both its military and commercial influence. At the same time, the acquisition of the Philippines created new vulnerabilities. The islands proved to be difficult and expensive to defend, especially against Japan, the emerging power in Asia. Should the Japanese choose to expand southward, the U.S. would find itself at war. Less than 4 decades later, in December 1941, only days after the attack on Pearl Harbor, the Japanese invaded the Philippines and held the islands for most of World War II. The Philippines remained an American colony until 1946. The ratification of a peace treaty with Spain in February 1898 allowed McKinley to address land grabs in China that threatened to close access to the vast China market. With hundreds of millions of potential consumers for American goods, the China market accounted for $15 million in American exports between 1895 and 1900, quadrupling in those 5 years. American industries grew increasingly dependent on China, especially textiles, iron and steel, and petroleum. Just recovering from the devastating depression of the 1890s, the U.S. acted forcefully to blunt any limitations to the lucrative China market. In 1899, Secretary of State John Hay articulated American policy by penning the first open-door notes addressed to the world's powers. The notes requested that they open up areas claimed by each power, its sphere of interest, to other nations, such as the U.S., to allow them to compete fairly for Chinese trade, charging them the same shipping and railway fees they placed on their own citizens. He also requested that world powers respect the integrity of China and allow the Chinese themselves to raise and collect tariffs within these spheres of interest. Hay's open-door notes initially prompted only minimal response. Great Britain and Japan affirmed the policy. The remaining powers, France, Germany, and Russia, evaded a firm commitment to the open door policy. They simply refused to ensure its implementation. But Hay had made the claim that the world's powers had consented to the open door in China. Confident that the U.S. could compete successfully on a fair and equal playing ground, Hay had successfully, through diplomatic means, achieved tacit agreement for the U.S. to market its goods to all of China. But after years of being invaded and picked apart by foreign powers, the Chinese fought back. In 1900, a secret organization called the Righteous and Harmonious Fist, dubbed the Boxers by foreigners for their boxing rituals, began a violent attack to eradicate, quote, foreign devils and their myriad influences in China. The expulsion of foreign influences, they believed, would revitalize their downtrodden nation and usher in a new, glorious age. Encouraged by the Dowager Cixi, the Boxers especially targeted Christians, both foreign and Chinese converts, who undermined Chinese traditions. The number of Christian missions in China had exploded in the 1890s, along with trade, with their rebellion focused largely in Beijing and the surrounding country. The Boxers killed suspected Chinese Christians on site and forced missionaries to flee for protection, as Boxers destroyed their churches and residencies. After the Boxers successfully attacked foreign ministries, even killing the German minister and cutting off all communications between Beijing and the outside world, foreign powers, including the U.S., mobilized quickly and sent an international force to suppress the rebellion. President McKinley ordered 50,000 American troops from Manila to China, fearing that the Boxer Rebellion would be used by other powers to shut the open door and bolster the spheres of interest. By August 1900, the International Army captured Beijing, released the besieged foreigners there, and smothered the Boxer Rebellion. Hay's approach to expanding American power in China set the course for subsequent foreign policy in the 20th century. Policymakers emphasized diplomacy that established unrestricted trade rather than territorial expansion. The U.S. had joined the club of political imperialists, but the price had been steep. In the first decades of the 20th century, the U.S. focused on expanding its commercial empire instead of adding to its territorial empire. Whether Roosevelt's big stick or Taft's dollar diplomacy, presidential power to define foreign policy expanded considerably and at the expense of Congress. Roosevelt especially helped define the modern presidency by acting quickly and independently on matters of foreign relations. Although they were a study of contrast in appearance, personality, and style, neither Roosevelt nor Taft hesitated to commit American troops to Latin America in defense of American interests and domination. During their presidencies from 1901 to 1913, the U.S. intervened 12 times in Latin America, in Honduras, the Dominican Republic, Cuba, Nicaragua, and Panama. The U.S. established itself as the, quote, policeman of Latin America, and this role secured American domination of its neighbors but led to strained relations. With its colonization of the Philippines as its foothold in Asia, the U.S. also continued to expand there commercially and to defend any infringement of its trade. Both Roosevelt and Taft ultimately expanded the U.S.'s role and influence on the world stage between 1901 and 1912 and set the course for the leading role the nation would play in world affairs for the rest of the 20th century. Although never a unified movement, progressive reform coalesced around several common principles. Rejecting unregulated markets and cutthroat individualism, but also fearing an all-powerful state, progressives sought a middle way to conserve capitalism while eliminating its excesses. They sought reform, not revolution. They demanded state intervention to offset the power of corporations and fought against monopolies to protect what they deemed the, quote, public interest. As Theodore Roosevelt, who in many ways embodied progressivism, proclaimed in 1912, quote, this new movement, proposes to put at the service of all our people the collective power of the government through their government agencies. Progressives also sought to connect diverse peoples and interests, knitting a fragmented society into an organic whole. Progressives sought to build bridges between the rich and poor, native-born and immigrant, and foster a sense of common purpose in their increasingly anonymous, segmented world. They were optimistic and energetic, with a deep faith in the malleability of human nature. Progressives denounced the cult of individualism for social connection and cooperation. Progressives also believed in applying the tools of the modern corporation to social problems. Emphasizing efficiency and specialization, they gathered and analyzed information and called on experts to fashion rational solutions. Progressives first addressed the problems closest to them, those that impacted their daily lives directly. Everyday and middle-class urban dwellers faced a wide range of problems that they simply could not avoid. Filth, pollution, unclean water, and lack of sanitary sewage systems spawned disease and misery that knew no neighborhood boundaries. The stench of uncollected garbage wafted from city streets. Contracts for city services often went to those who offered the largest bribes or kickbacks to city officials. Even getting to work on the streetcar became a daily challenge as privately owned streetcar companies established monopolies of confusing and highly inefficient systems. Inadequate housing increased the misery of poor urbanites living in crowded tenements. Middle-class residents also worried about the moral climate of their cities and were horrified by the proliferation of saloons and houses of prostitution. Progressive women played an especially crucial role as, quote, municipal housekeepers, working to clean up cities both physically and morally, and protecting and defending children and their right to a healthy childhood. With city governments often ruled by corrupt political bosses and machines and unresponsive to urban problems, progressives rallied for good government, honest, efficient government that would work for the good of all citizens. Investigative reporters such as Lincoln Steffens, expanding on the muckraking work of earlier journalists, documented the deep corruption at the core of city governments and confirmed what most city dwellers already knew. In 1904, Steffens published The Shame of Cities, focusing on corruption in 6 major cities. He insisted that the fault lay not with crooked politicians, any one class, or the ignorant foreign immigrant. Instead, he declared, quote, "The misgovernment of the American people is misgovernment by the American people," end quote. To get good government, Steffens argued, Americans needed to demand it. Progressives initiated good government movements in nearly every city across the country. Spanning both major parties, urban reformers formed national organizations such as the National Municipal League. They organized reform tickets that managed to oust some of the nation's most prominent political machines, including New York's Tammany Hall in 1901. Using the corporation as their model, they established new, efficient, and honest forms of municipal government. The disastrous Galveston hurricane of 1900 sparked a new model of city governance. To respond quickly and efficiently to the storm's destruction, Galveston replaced its government with a special commission of expert managers who took charge of various city departments. This system was so effective that it evolved into the city manager system, in which a nonpartisan expert administered city services, aided by career civil servants. Progressives also revised city charters to eliminate the old ward system of voting, whereby each ward elected a representative to the city council, a system fundamental to perpetuating political machines. They replaced this system with at-large elections for city councils, school committees, and mayor. Good government also entailed more efficient and effective municipal services. In the late 19th century, political machines awarded contracts for an array of services and utilities, such as water, garbage collection, sewage, streetcars, gas, and telephone service. In many cities, these had become, in the words of one reformer, private monopolies. The political masters of the people, charging unjust rates and even influencing elections to maintain their control. The ownership of streetcar lines became especially contentious in American cities. Impressed by the success of Glasgow, Scotland, in establishing municipal ownership of the streetcar system, progressives convinced city officials in Toledo, Ohio, for example, to purchase the jumble of privately owned transit lines and manage them as a singular, efficient system. Following European examples, some cities took over established municipal water, gas, and electric companies. Although municipal ownership of public services was never as extensive as in Europe, many U.S. cities nevertheless benefited from this battle to improve city life. Although progressives often spoke of the importance of strengthening social bonds among urban society's diverse elements, racial segregation in the nation's cities was a product of the progressive era. Some reformers justified segregation as a modern solution to the race problem, a way of eliminating conflict between the races and protecting blacks from further violence, such as lynching. Segregation laws, known as Jim Crow laws, which legally separated people according to race, originated on Southern railroads in the mid-1880s. Southern whites grew especially resentful of middle-class blacks who purchased tickets in first-class cars and traveled with them as equals. In addition, when black men sat near unaccompanied white women in the parlor-like cars, white men grew especially anxious regarding the, quote, protection of their women, as they viewed all black men as potential rapists. As a result, Southern states passed legislation separating blacks and whites on railroad cars. Homer Plessy, with the support of the Citizens Committee to test the constitutionality of the separate car law, challenged Louisiana's 1890 law, which forced blacks to sit in a separate colored section all the way to the Supreme Court. Plessy's law argued that the Louisiana law, by denying Plessy equal protection under the law, violated the 14th Amendment of the Constitution. In Plessy v. Ferguson in 1896, the Supreme Court upheld segregation, ruling 7-1 that the law was, quote, reasonable, as it was consistent with local custom and helped preserve the public peace and good order. Segregation was constitutional, the court argued, as long as separate but equal facilities were provided, and the court gave its blessing to state-mandated segregation. The ruling constituted a massive setback for African Americans. Segregation by both legal statute and unwritten law soon spread to nearly every aspect of life in the South. Railroad waiting rooms, streetcars, public parks, movie theaters, employment, and even cemeteries were segregated. And though facilities were almost always segregated, they were seldom equal in the South, and segregation provided a daily reminder to African Americans of their, quote, inferior status. Southern progressives often justified segregation as an enlightened solution to the race problem, a middle way between the extremes of race war, which they deemed a threat as blacks and whites interacted in cities, and the outright expulsion of blacks. Whites attacked blacks with a new ferocity in the late 19th century, conjuring up frightening images of the, quote, black beast rapist, intent on ravishing white women to justify the lynching of thousands of black men. Lynchings, often public affairs in which black victims were often tortured and then hanged or shot, averaged more than 100 a year in the 1880s and 1890s. They particularly spiked in 1892, with 241 cases reported, 180 of them occurring in the South. Segregation, insisted Southern progressives, would protect blacks by reducing interracial contact. Alabama progressive Edgar Gardner Murphy, an Episcopal clergyman, insisted that the white South had a, quote, obligation to improve the black race, and could do so only by establishing a protective wall behind which blacks would be safe and given the chance to develop on their own. Northern white progressives did little to renounce Jim Crow in the South. In fact, they supported informal segregation in their own cities. Although 90% of African Americans still resided in the South in 1900, a black migration to the North was evident by the 20th century and accelerated during World War I with new employment opportunities. Even as most Northern schools remained integrated, organizations in some Northern cities, such as the YMCA, rejected black members. Hotels, restaurants, and department stores regularly refused service to blacks. Unable to purchase or rent homes in white residential areas, African Americans, regardless of class, found themselves relegated to black-only neighborhoods. Even some of the most open-minded progressives, such as Jane Addams, never managed to bridge the racial divide. Although Hull House opened its arms to European immigrants, settlement house workers there made little effort to reach out to their black neighbors. One Hull House worker noted that when black women attended events at the settlement house, they, quote, were not always received warmly, as the settlement seemed unwilling to come to grips with the Negro problem in its own environs, while willing to be concerned with the same problem elsewhere in the city. Segregation, however, did not improve race relations. Anti-black riots exploded in the nation's cities. In September 1906, for example, a 3-day riot erupted in Atlanta when a mob of armed white men, 10,000 strong, and fueled by rumors of a black man's assault of a white woman, terrorized the city's blacks. They targeted black businesses, attacking, killing, and torturing black men and women in their path, and leaving approximately 25 dead and dozens wounded. Such seething and vitriolic racism elicited a response by black intellectuals and social activists. Booker T. Washington rose to national prominence by advocating a strategy of economic development over political engagement to dampen the fires of race hatred. At the Atlanta Exposition in 1895, he delivered an address that would make him famous. He argued that agitation of questions of social equality is the extremist folly, and that African Americans prepare themselves for full-fledged citizenship and equality by finding a niche in the Southern economy through industrial education and enterprise to earn the respect of white people who would ultimately reward them with political rights. Other black leaders, such as W.E.B. Du Bois, criticized what he saw as Washington's accommodation to white supremacy, what he termed the Atlanta Compromise. The burden for Jim Crow lay not on the Negro's shoulders, Du Bois argued, but on the nation. Blacks needed to fight for the equality they were guaranteed in the aftermath of the Civil War. The hands of none of us are clean, he wrote, if we bend not our energies to righting these wrongs. As such, Du Bois helped found the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People in 1909. The NAACP investigated and publicized lynching, condemned the segregation of federal offices, and organized protests against the movie The Birth of a Nation. Ida B. Wells, a black clubwoman and later a founding member of the NAACP, spearheaded the attack on lynching. In 1887, she became an editor and part owner of the Free Speech, a small Memphis newspaper. When a mob lynched 3 black grocers in 1892, Wells came to the realization that lynching had nothing to do with the alleged rape of white women. Instead, it was a, quote, excuse to get rid of Negroes who were acquiring wealth and property and thus keep the race terrorized and keep the nigger down, end quote. For revealing this truth in her newspaper, Wells became the target of white violence, her newspaper offices and presses destroyed. She fled the South and settled in Chicago. Threatened with death should she ever return to Memphis, she continued her crusade against lynching and conducting detailed investigations. Wells then took her campaign abroad, where she lectured and created international alliances with London's anti-lynching committee. Wells's British lectures forced Memphis city leaders to condemn lynching when they began to worry that bad publicity might damage their cotton trade with Great Britain. Wells also worked tirelessly for other progressive causes, including women's suffrage. Despite the heroic efforts of Wells, Du Bois, and countless other black Americans, this period marked a low point for American race relations. In 1908, at one of the meetings of the Niagara Movement, a precursor to the NAACP, Du Bois noted this precipitous decline since Reconstruction. He wrote, "Once we were told, be worthy and fit, and the ways are open. Today, the avenues of advancement in the Army, Navy, and civil service, and even in business and professional life, are continually closed to black applicants of proven fitness, simply on the excuse of race and color." By 1900, to the concern of many citizens, nearly every aspect of the American economy was dominated by massive corporations. Americans purchased their meat from the Beef Trust, sugar from the Sugar Trust, and their fuel from Standard Oil. Nearly all progressives believed that big business was far too powerful and required regulation, but they disagreed on both the means and the end goals of regulation. Some, calling for the nationalization of corporations, claimed that public ownership was the only solution. Others, rejecting socialism as too extreme, called for various types of governmental regulation to keep capitalism intact. But interventionists also varied by degree. Some, demanding a complete breakup of big business, imagined a return to small, competitive businesses that would compete on a level playing field. Others insisted on only minimal regulation of the worst offenders. President Theodore Roosevelt made a tax on trusts a hallmark of his presidency. The executive, he boldly proclaimed, is the steward of the public welfare. Happily using the bully pulpit of the presidency to attack big business, Roosevelt nonetheless did so in a decidedly selective and moderate fashion. He made it clear that he was not opposed to big business in principle. Roosevelt believed that large corporations were not only inevitable, part of the natural evolution of business, but they also benefited society through the abundant production of cheap goods and their ability to compete internationally and strengthen the American presence globally. There were, he insisted, both good trusts and bad trusts. Only bad trusts, those engaged in unfair competition and practices such as price fixing and issuing watered stock, should be broken apart. Carefully choosing several high-profile trusts to attack, Roosevelt soon gained a reputation as a trust buster. In 1902, he took on Northern Securities, a planned railroad monopoly created principally by J.P. Morgan and John D. Rockefeller. At Roosevelt's request, the Justice Department successfully prosecuted the company by using the Sherman Antitrust Act. It charged the company with illegal restraint of trade and claimed that its practices led to higher and unfair freight charges for consumers. A few months later, the Justice Department successfully attacked the Beef Trust, especially unpopular with the public given the, quote, embalmed beef scandal that had poisoned and killed more U.S. soldiers than Spanish bullets in the Spanish-American War. The federal government charged the Beef Trust with price fixing and restraining competition. To the delight of Roosevelt and the public, the Supreme Court upheld both cases, and both trusts were dissolved. In his second term, Roosevelt continued his selective prosecution of bad trusts. Promising a, quote, square deal for the American people, Roosevelt responded to growing public outrage against Standard Oil. Probably the most hated company in the nation, Standard's reputation and that of its head, John D. Rockefeller, grew even worse after muckraker Ida Tarbell published a massive expose in the company, published in McClure's magazine from 1902 to 1904. The report depicted Standard as a cutthroat, win-at-all-costs corporation with no concern for public good, and Rockefeller as unscrupulous and money-mad. Tarbell's efforts ultimately sparked hearings and investigations of Standard Oil at the state level, and the company soon faced prosecution in 8 states. In 1906, the federal government began its successful prosecution of Standard Oil, and in 1911, the Supreme Court upheld a federal court's ruling charging the company with violating antitrust laws and ordered that the massive trust be dismantled. Roosevelt, learning of the news while on safari in Africa, called the decision, quote, one of the most signal triumphs of decency which has ever been won in our country, end quote. Roosevelt's attack on the trusts, however, hardly made a dent in the power of massive corporations. Despite upholding the dismantling of several key trusts, courts, remaining conservative in their interpretation of the Sherman Antitrust Act, pointed out that only reasonable limits on interstate trade were illegal. Rather than shriveling up, Standard, for example, continued to flourish, and Rockefeller's wealth and power were undamaged and actually enhanced. Despite Roosevelt's reputation as a trust buster, his successor, Republican William Howard Taft, actually engaged in twice as many antitrust suits as Roosevelt. His administration successfully prosecuted U.S. Steel and the Sugar Trust. But the corpulent and lumbering president, the antithesis of the charismatic, athletic, and energetic Roosevelt, never managed to get credit for his accomplishments, as he was unable to maintain the positive relationship with the press and public cultivated by Roosevelt. Although Taft admired Roosevelt, he was more conservative than his predecessor. During his presidency, he aimed to rein in the expanding role of the federal government. Through a series of missteps, Taft managed to disillusion both the progressive and conservative old guard wings of the Republican Party. His blunders led to Roosevelt's decision to run as the progressive Bull Moose candidate in 1912, which split the party and guaranteed Taft's defeat by Woodrow Wilson. During the 1912 campaign, Wilson, a Democratic progressive, rejected Roosevelt's distinction between good and bad trust, as well as his vision of an expansive federal government. The, quote, New Nationalism, Roosevelt's platform in 1912, advocated expansive federal government used for the public interest. By contrast, Wilson attacked all bigness, whether in government or business, and advocated the, quote, New Freedom, in hopes of restoring small business and fair competition enforced with only minimal government interference. As president, however, Wilson did expand the power of the federal government and used it to regulate business. Wilson signed more reform legislation than Roosevelt and Taft combined. In 1913, he signed the Federal Reserve Act to create a central banking system that significantly strengthened the country's financial system by, among other functions, overseeing the nation's monetary policy and providing supervision and regulation to the nation's banks. The next year, under Wilson's direction, Congress passed the Clayton Antitrust Act, meant to supplement and strengthen the Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890 by outlawing a number of practices such as exclusive sales contracts, holding companies, and price discrimination. Moreover, the law outlawed the use of injunctions against labor unions and legalized peaceful strikes, pickets, and boycotts. But like the Sherman Act before it, the Clayton Act also contained numerous loopholes. Subsequent court decisions also weakened its effectiveness. Notably, the Clayton Act was signed at the same time as another important regulatory act establishing the Federal Trade Commission. The FTC was charged with overseeing and regulating business activity and halting unfair trade practices. Another key reform, initiated by the Taft administration and instituted under Wilson's, was the 1913 ratification of the 16th Amendment, authorizing a federal income tax on both personal and corporate income. Before this time, the U.S. had one of the lowest tax rates in the industrial world. While America's establishment of empire required additional funding, populists, socialists, and progressives had long called for a graduated income tax that would place a heavier tax burden on wealthy individuals and corporations. Before 1913, federal revenues derived from public lands and customs. After 1913, the federal income tax would provide the bulk of monies that filled federal coffers for expenditures from social services to military spending. American progressives responded with mixed sentiments to the news of the outbreak of war in Europe in August 1914 and later to U.S. involvement in the war in 1917. Never united, progressives found themselves sharply divided by the war. Some progressives viewed it as a tragic setback, whereas others seized the war as a fortuitous moment to expand federal regulatory power and forge a stronger nation and world. In many ways, World War I proved to be the death knell of progressivism. Boldly expanding federal power and the nation's global role, President Wilson and his supporters overreached, sowing seeds for a massive backlash in the post-war years. Although progressives in the U.S. overall did not have the same success as their European counterparts, they nevertheless initiated reforms that permanently changed the role of government in the lives of the nation's citizens. For some progressives, World War I shattered their optimistic faith in human progress and the improvability of human nature. Some progressives had even suggested that humankind had outgrown war and its remarkable advancement. It was unthinkable to them that the war and progress could go hand in hand. Both Jane Addams and Wisconsin's Fighting Bob La Follette boldly condemned American involvement in the European conflict. Addams predicted that the war would, quote, set back progress for a generation. La Follette, who after successful terms as governor was elected senator from Wisconsin, was only one of 6 senators who voted against the war declaration in April 1917, the popular press depicting him as a German-loving traitor. Other progressives, however, saw the war as a golden moment, a chance to institute bold changes both abroad and at home. President Wilson, who framed the war as a war to make the world safe for democracy, envisioned an America providing world leadership, molding a progressive world order that would dismantle empires and tyrannical governments and replace them with democratic institutions. He and other progressives also saw the war as an opportunity to broaden public power at home by expanding the scope of the federal government and diminishing the clout of private enterprise. In addition, they hoped to create a sense of common purpose among the American people. When Congress declared war against the Central Powers in April 1917, the Wilson administration faced the paramount task of mobilizing the nation on an unprecedented scale. Massive mobilization required a major expansion of federal power and unprecedented interventions in business and labor. New federal agencies, taking charge of regulating nearly every aspect of the American economy, advanced the progressive agenda. The federal government extended its unprecedented economic expansion into a war for the American mind. Fearing disloyalty, especially among hyphenated Americans, those who had come to the U.S. as part of the new immigration of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the Wilson administration embarked on a massive propaganda campaign to ensure the loyalty of all the American people. German Americans became prime victims of patriotic hatred. Labor radicals, especially socialists, also bore the brunt of the federal government's repression. A series of laws, including the Alien Act, the Alien Enemies Act, the Espionage Act, the Sedition Act, and the Selective Service Act, allowed the federal government to fine, jail, and in some cases even deport anyone who hindered the war effort. Free speech was an early casualty of the war. Socialist Eugene V. Debs, who had garnered nearly 1 million votes for president in 1912, was slapped with a 10-year jail sentence for speaking out in opposition to the war. The federal government also conducted raids on international workers of the world halls, using the war as a chance to rid the nation of the troublesome Wobblies once and for all. Hundreds of them were jailed, and one was lynched. While the New York Times condemned the murder, the newspaper quickly added that, quote, the IWW agitators are, in effect, and perhaps in fact, agents of Germany, end quote. The war also heightened racial conflict. When the war halted European immigration, desperate Southern blacks seized the opportunity to migrate north and fill the ranks of Northern industry. The Great Migration, as it would be known, changed the face of Northern cities as blacks, leaving the repression of the Jim Crow South behind for opportunity in the North, quote, voted with their feet. The massive influx of blacks and job competition led to some of the worst race riots in the nation's history. In East St. Louis, in July 1917, angry white mobs, incited by a rumor that a white man had been killed by a black man, raged for a week, leaving at least several hundred blacks dead. The end of the war in November 1918 did not bring about the end of conflict and repression. In 1919, 25 race riots ripped apart American cities. At the same time, 100% Americanism soon became channeled into a Red Scare, in which the federal government crushed what remained of the nation's radical organizations. Labor unions, intent on keeping the gains they had made during the war, while employers aimed to regain their power, called a series of strikes in some of the nation's most important industries, including textiles and steel. Rather than unite Americans by forging the new, collective nation that progressives hoped for, the war and its aftermath seemed only to divide the country. The war unleashed a rational and often uncontrollable hatred that was the antithesis of the rational and organic progressive vision of society. The American public had grown tired of remaking their nation and the world, and many progressives had become disillusioned, their faith in humanity shattered. The U.S. Senate, rejecting the Treaty of Versailles and Wilson's progressive vision to, quote, make the world safe for democracy and a new world order, reflected the general sentiments of a nation weary of crusades, both domestically and internationally. Despite the domestic calamities engendered by the Great War, women's suffrage, fought for by generations of women since the mid-19th century, received a major boost. In the 1910s, a new generation of suffragists, headed by Alice Paul, reinvigorated the movement. In 1907, Paul, a settlement house worker, moved to England to study social work and met suffragists Christabel and Emmeline Pankhurst. Convinced that women would never get the vote with petitions or persuasion, the Pankhursts advocated direct action, which included civil disobedience and hunger strikes to publicize their cause. Paul became a disciple of the Pankhursts, participated in numerous protests, and even served jail time for activities. Paul returned to the U.S. in 1910 and immediately joined the National American Women's Suffrage Association, headed by Carrie Chapman Catt. She soon found herself at odds with Catt, and while Catt endorsed Wilson for president in 1912 and considered him an ally in the struggle, Paul borrowed a page from her British mentors and insisted on pressuring Wilson directly through dramatic protests. In 1913, Paul organized a massive parade of women down Pennsylvania Avenue that coincided with Wilson's inauguration. The parade turned violent when male opponents assaulted suffragists. In 1916, Paul severed ties with Catt and Nassau, and with like-minded suffragists, formed the National Women's Party. While Alice Paul and her compatriots successfully pressured Wilson, others played a major role in supporting the war effort, a contribution Wilson could not ignore. More than 1 million American women labored in war industries at home. Women also served as nurses and telephone operators for the American military and worked as volunteers in France for organizations such as the YMCA. In 1920, the states ratified the 19th Amendment to the Constitution. Compared to their European counterparts, progressives in the U.S. had only limited success. In housing, social insurance, and factory legislation, progressives found their reforms curtailed by what one European called the, quote, cast iron constitution of the U.S., traditional legal concepts that emphasized individual and property rights at the expense of a powerful state intervening for the common good. Moreover, progressives seldom transcended class or race. They too often imposed their own middle-class values on those they aimed to help. White progressives not only remained aloof from the nation's race problems, they also often enhanced them. And as moderates treading the middle way, they tended to exhibit caution, which limited the impact of their reforms. Intent on securing their own political power, they diminished the power of those they deemed less worthy, especially immigrants, the working class, and African Americans. But at the same time, they also managed to curb some of industrial capitalism's worst excesses while improving the lives of countless men, women, and children through their wide array of reforms. And despite the shortcomings of their movement, progressives nevertheless bequeathed a valuable legacy to subsequent generations.
I think I have enough of my own. It's all about my Lucy trouble, and she has caused my heart to mourn. There's another coon about her from Virginia. In society, he's the leader of the day. And now my honey gal is going to quit me. Yes, she's gone and drove the coon away. She'd no excuse to turn me loose. I feel abused, and I'm all confused. Lord. 'Cause he's what she's in this day with. Oh, coons look alike to me. I've got another beau, you see, and he's just as good to me. Hey, you nigga, and a tragedy. He spends his money free. I know we can't agree, so I'd like to know how all coons look alike to me. Never say the word to hurt her feelings. I always bought a present 5 to 4, and now my brain will sorrow am I reeling, 'cause she won't accept them anymore. If I treated her wrong, she may have loved me, like all the rest, she's gonna let me down. If I'm lucky, I'm going to catch my policy and win the sweet thing from town. For I'm worried, yes, I'm desperate, and I've been jealous, and I'll get dangerous. Oh my, it is what she says to me. Well, all cones look alike to me. I've got another beau, you see, and he's just as good to me as you, nigga, ever tried to be. He spends his money free. I know we can't agree, so I'd like to know how all coons look alike to me.